Hello everyone, welcome to Week 13's lecture on Neoliberal Globalization. Today we will be looking at the following key terms and frameworks: colonialism, neoliberalism, the IMF, globalization, GDP, and the Western care crisis. So first we're going to take a look at one of the key terms, colonialism. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of history and context, and then I'm going to ask you to try to think about how this how this review applies to the question outlined in the slide, the reflection, where did my beliefs and generalizations about life and my expectations come from? Right? So the implicit ideologies that shape your life, I want you to kind of trace them back and try to understand what their foundations are and where they come from. So I'm going to try to build our understanding of colonialism by providing a very brief and Spark Notes version of colonial history. So in the colonial period, European nations came to Asia, Africa, and South America, and they conquered indigenous people and stripped them of their heritage and cultures as a means of dominating them. They replaced these indigenous groups' original subsistence strategies with cash cropping methods, which supported the European, hierarchical structure. Also made it so that these indigenous groups couldn't survive without European oppressors' political, ideological, and especially economic structures. When we entered the 20th century, we see that official European rule is mostly over in indigenous parts of Asia, Africa, and South America. But even though these European and Western oppressors left, ideological structures, the economic and the political structures they built still stand. This colonial system that exists in a post-colonial era subliminally subjugates independent nations that were previously occupied by these oppressive groups. That brings us to our thought experiment. I would like everyone to quickly think of what an average American is, or an average human is. Typically, when I ask students or people to think of an average American, they think of a white, able-bodied, middle-aged male. And this perception is reflected in the Google result that I have for you in this slide. Social scientists can see that colonial ideas and structures continue into a modern age because when we use a modern digital technology like Google to think about what a normal human or an average girl or an average boy looks like, what you will mostly get is a bunch of white, able-bodied people. So if there are far more non-white humans alive today, so the majority of people don't have European ancestry, why do we perceive the average person as being white, as a colonial stereotype? So we can begin to unpack that really big question in discussion of other key concepts like neoliberalism. So to begin this discussion on neoliberalism, I wanted to very quickly outline the historical context surrounding neoliberalism. The U.S.'s dominant economic structure was previously something called Keynesian economics, and that was something that was prominent following the Great Depression because it allowed for a greater public safety net and then also increased restrictions of private industry in order to protect the people. After World War II, the U.S. shifted to a completely different economic positioning, which valued corporatization, commodification, and or the association of happiness, success with material goods. We shifted towards profit over people, and suddenly private industry, became stronger than oversight. During the 1960s and 70s, there was a huge push in the West for civil rights. And so we see a huge increase in labor unions and also a pretty sizable increase in the minimum wage. And so therefore there was no more dirt cheap labor in the formal economic sector of the US. So what companies did is they started to move labor across the border. This movement of low-income jobs and factories from the global north to the global south is what really underpinned 1980s referred to as neoliberalism. Therefore, neoliberalism can be understood as this hyper expansion of the private industry over public interest. And this is where we see minimum government involvement or oversight, and also companies are allowed to pretty much do whatever they want as long as it's not in the US or within Western nations. And these companies are trying to find the cheapest possible labor sources outside of the US or Western societies in a quote-unquote free market. So when we look at this globalized expansion of neoliberalism in our modern era, we have to beg the question, why does the government of these previously colonized nations allow Western factories to come in and instill lower living standards due to low wage and poor working conditions into their countries? Why are foreign interests and American interests given over the general indigenous population? We begin to understand the answer to that question when we begin to once again unpack another big vocab term, the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund. Following World War II, the Western-controlled, or mainly US-controlled, World Bank offered quote-unquote undeveloped nations, which is a ridiculously biased term, a ridiculously large loan so that these quote-unquote undeveloped nations could establish themselves within the Western economic system that was dominating the global market at the time and continues to dominate the global market. So we can understand the IMF as pretty much writing the rules to a very unfair and a pretty much rigged economic game where, previously classified undeveloped nations were unable to prosper and therefore continue to be unable to prosper because they were previously offered a ridiculous loan amount and now to this day in the modern era are trying to pay back the interest and the loan. So the IMF created this divide in the third world and the first world by offering quote-unquote undeveloped nations a loan amount that they would never be able to pay back, and also making the interest on those loans a ridiculous amount, which people in this modern era are still pay back. So because these nations owe the West, mostly the US, a big debt, the US is able to use their economic position as being the loaner to force these nations that took the loan to establish a foreign economic policy that is favorable to private industry. If we look back in history, we see that many of these nations in the global south, or aka third world nations, had public policies and a lot of incredible social infrastructure like public education, public health care, and other, oversight and controls which protected their people. But because of their debt and because of their obligation to the IMF and the World Bank, they were forced to quote-unquote cut spending and therefore eliminate these programs. So this, whole cycle where the West was able to impose control and impose, a neoliberal reality in the global South created a third world quality of life for citizens that live in the global South that don't live in, Western privileged nations. Specifically addressing globalization as a key concept, I want everyone to understand that this is the economic and political and ideological reproduction of colonial domination and the oppressive colonial hierarchy in the modern era. So pretty much it's the reification of this, archaic colonial perception and political and economic structure, reified and reproduced through neoliberal economic forces in the modern era. Building from this discussion, I wanted to quickly outline what the GDP is and also acknowledge the role that it serves in reproducing and reifying the globalized neoliberal market, which is founded in colonial ideals and a colonial-based hierarchical structure. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and this is a colonial-based Western construct that we use to evaluate a nation's quote-unquote level of development and also establish their economic status and if they are in the first world or third world within the US-controlled and rigged global market. The GDP is how colonial forces or Western forces continue to dominate nations in the global South. They're nations that were given loans by the IMF and deemed as less developed than those in the global North. So the GDP can be understood as the physical and explicit manifestation of a colonial-based neoliberal system on a global scale. The IMF and the GDP and other globalized proponents of neoliberalism can be understood as the engine which drives and asserts colonial ideas and structures, perceptions in the 21st century. This colonial-based perception system is behind the US and Western care work crisis. The Western care work crisis is something that is rarely outlined in academia, but it is something that, especially during the pandemic, pretty much all Americans have experienced. It is the direct result and the consequence of neoliberal ideologies conflicting and contrasting, being contradictory to the colonial perceptions that they are built from. So certain neoliberal systems assert that all Americans, regardless of gender, are expected to participate in paid labor and engage in the formal economy in order to maintain the US's elite GDP rank. But these neoliberal assumptions about labor in the West directly contradict the subliminal colonial ideologies that they are based upon. Thereby, the neoliberal systems that allow the US to maintain this elite GDP rank by requiring that all US citizens participate in 8 to 12 hours a day of formal labor clash with subliminal colonial ideologies that assign US women a full-time, unpaid caregiving job of cooking, cleaning, and childcare, which expands to more than 15 hours a day. So the question is, how do American women work 8 to 12 hours a day in the formal economy and then also work 15 to 20 hours a day in the informal economy? Every human only has 24 hours in their day, but for some reason, in this neoliberal, hierarchical, post-colonial system, we assume that especially American women can do over 24 hours of unpaid and unrecognized care work in addition to their formal economic participation. Mothers who are A, American citizens, and B, most importantly, who have a elevated position within the neoliberal hierarchy are able to outsource and employ other women that fall into a lower socioeconomic and neoliberal category. American women that are wealthy and have the resources to hire typically women from the global South that have immigrated to the US to fulfill some of their care work responsibilities, such as childcare, cooking, cleaning, laundry, etc. So I want you guys to start thinking about how these concepts apply to the specific film that we watched this week, Between Us. How do concepts like neoliberalism, colonialism, and certain gendered theoretical components connect to the film Between Us? Here are some important discussion questions that you should start to unravel and ponder before your next discussion meeting about the film.